Very few of us will ever get closer to the royal family than a fleeting glimpse during official processions, as only a handful of royal retainers are ever granted access to those upstairs.
The so-called circle of trust, which never leaks and is unwaveringly loyal.
The pressure is on for the downstairs staff, including butlers and bodyguards.
You have to get it right every day. The bad guy only has to get it right once.
Press team and dressers to keep the machinery of the monarchy in full flow.
It's about knowing who the royals can trust and who they can't trust.
As the royal commentators dispel the myth of the monarchy.
If you're a child in the royal family and you're hoping to grow up and go to an ordinary school, you can forget it.
They ended up with the king doing the conga round the staterooms of Buckingham Palace.
Experts will break down key archive of crucial moments in royal history.
It was a fairy tale created by the Grimm brothers.
Anybody entering the royal circles needs to come with their A game.
So prepare to discover what actually happens when blue blood runs red.
What have you been doing in here all day?
This is The Royals Revealed. In this episode, the royal family rely on their retainers for safety, protocol, and public image.
On a day-to-day basis, you've got footmen, you've got butlers, chefs, florists, office staff.
These are aristocratic residences on steroids with a small army of downstairs staff.
The Queen employs around about 330 people in Buckingham Palace, Windsor Castle, Holyrood House, Balmoral, Sandringham.
But closer confidants are there to be a rock in their hours of need.
Finally conceived, and finally...
You can see the way that he uses the notes more as a prop. It implies that it was the people out there that he found daunting.
You have a queen of decades standing, becoming close to a working class chap.
In the solo photographs of John Brown, he's got the biggest sporran I've ever seen.
And often, unseen relationships help prepare the royals for every eventuality in the public glare. Being members of the most famous family in the world comes the need for protection on a whole host of levels. And never was that brought home with more severity than one terrifying evening in 1974.
Now, the story, as far as we know it, is this. Princess Anne and Mark Phillips were on their way either to or from Buckingham Palace when a car drove in front of their official vehicle and stopped it. Now, a gunman got out and fired several shots through the windscreen.
The episode is memorable for the fact that Princess Anne was having absolutely none of it, was refusing with her lady-in-waiting to get out of the car under the gunman's instructions.
The assailant, Ian Ball, an unemployed labourer, was ultimately ordered to serve 41 years at Her Majesty's pleasure.
It was an unprecedented event. It showed the royals could be vulnerable when they were travelling about the place and stopped at major junctions. And subsequently, you do see royal cars now in an escort situation to ensure that if any trouble ensues, then somebody can immediately be on hand.
A major overhaul of security ensued, and there's now over 100 protection officers in the department with the licence to intervene when necessary.
You always have the option as the protection officer to cancel the event, to turn to your principal and say it is now no longer safe and we have to leave.
And on a visit to an overcrowded market in Fiji in 2018, the Duchess of Sussex's protection officer was forced to make that decision.
Guys, out to the car.
That is the responsibility that you have as a protection officer, and that is the element of trust that your principal has in you.
Simon Morgan joined the Crown Security Department in 2007.
Royalty protection officers are some of the most highly trained and expensive police officers in the country. You are there to be a trusted member of the team, and you are there ultimately to preserve life.
And there's one part of the job guaranteed to up the ante in terms of tension.
The most nerve-wracking time is a royal walkabout, where you put a senior member of the British royal family into the public domain.
Buckingham Palace officials did not expect anything like this.
You are very much in that red zone. The royal family have cradle-to-grave protection, so you're actually looking at danger cues from them that there's something they're not happy with, as much as they're looking at you for something that you're not happy with.
Yet, is it even a double-edged sword that the spectacle of the security entourage further increases crowds?
In terms of your own personal safety, you can't just wander down the high street and go about your business without the Royal Protection Officers, 2 centimetres behind you. And once people pick up on that, then the public want to know, and then they're fascinated, and then they're in your face. So there is really no freedom to be yourself.
This fascination and need to keep the public in the loop poses further complications.
The fact that the Royal Diary is published sometimes 12 months in advance does make things a little bit difficult when you look at the threat and risk, because you are notifying the bad guy that something is going to happen on a certain day. So you're always dealing with that issue. From your perspective as a protection officer, you have to get it right every day. The bad guy only has to get it right once.
Yet a protection officer must stay one step ahead of the game.
The threat to the royal family is constantly evolving and changing, and remains at a very high level.
And if the worst came to the worst, there's a last resort.
Royalty protection officers are armed. It's part of your training. It is one of your tactical options that you have to deal with that protection package.
But you'll probably have never seen them packing heat.
The carriage of your weapon is something that needs to be also in a covert role. It's not something, even here in the UK, that people are used to seeing.
Fortunately, there were no serious incidents during Simon's 6 years in the role. But there was one moment in 1994 which could have changed the course of history.
Those of us present did fear that an attempt had been made on the Prince's life.
Every working royal must surround themselves with trusted aides. As many unseen heroes keep the monarchy in full flow within the palace and on the public-facing front line. And Prince Charles had to place his life in the hands of protection officers during a visit to Australia in 1994.
Prince Charles was about to present awards to the state's top HSC students, but before he could utter a word, chaos.
When something truly shocking happens, often there is a larger gap than we would imagine before the information goes from the top of the brain down into the emotional response part of the brain and the body. And funnily enough, that gap often gets filled in a way by what happens here, which is almost a look of faint amusement.
Charles may have frozen, but how did his team react?
You had a vastly experienced protection officer. In the first 3 or 4 seconds, he provided all the elements of his core competencies as a protection officer. He reacted spontaneously by getting up off his seat. He provided effective cover by putting himself in between the suspect and the principal.
The Prince was shielded by his personal bodyguard, who kicked a starter's pistol out of the man's hand.
You can look at the wider policing plan as to how that individual got to that point, but from the protection officer's perspective, then that's exactly what that protection officer is trained to do.
Unharmed, His Royal Highness remained remarkably composed, continuing his official duties as the man was taken away for questioning.
There's an inherent bravery as well. It's not really rabbit caught in the headlights. It's a kind of a mild bemusement, maybe not understanding all of the fear, but it's certainly not a fear response. And even when the bodyguard comes up and thumps into him, I think that annoys him more than anything else. I think he's more annoyed that somebody's tried to protect him than the guy by then laying on the ground.
But that wasn't the only incident down under which would have caused the personal protection officer's alarm, as the Queen got caught in the middle of an Aborigine protest at the cost of a new Parliament building in Canberra.
And then they sat down and turned their backs on the event they look on as a betrayal.
When you look at that particular footage, you have kind of two risks. You have the high risk, the things that you know about, the fact that the demonstration is taking place, and then you have the unknown risks. What are these people going to do?
But the sour note returned as her car was booed away from Parliament. They were not booing her personally, but as a symbol of white Australia.
So you always have to be mindful that any demonstration, as peaceful as it may seem, could always change, because somebody in that split second could see that this is their opportunity to bring their cause to the world's media.
Despite the unease in the air, the Queen remained unperturbed.
She stayed stoic. She was almost unflinching in that situation, and that shows a remarkable capability in terms of self-control. And she sort of, I think, may have gone into, this is the role I'm in, I'm doing my duty, I have a job to do, and I'm, laser focused.
This notion of keep calm and carry on has always filtered down to the legions of staff who help run the royal regime.
The Queen employs around about 330 people, and they work across the board in Buckingham Palace, Windsor Castle, Holyrood House, Balmoral, Sandringham.
These are aristocratic residences on steroids. All 5 houses are headed up by the Master of the House, who leads a small army of downstairs staff.
The Prince of Wales probably employs about 150. The Duke of Cambridge probably about 60.
On a day-to-day basis, you've got footmen, you've got butlers, chefs, florists, office staff.
No matter where you are in the hierarchy, everyone shares in a unique festive treat.
Every Christmas, the Queen gives a Christmas pudding to all her staff, as does the Prince of Wales.
It's a nice gesture to give a Christmas pudding. Pretty nice Christmas puddings at that too.
It's just a tradition that they've done for many years.
Grant Harold certainly earned his crust during a 7-year stint as a royal butler, primarily serving Prince Charles.
We conjure up these images of how butlers should act and behave and look and what they do. And so there is a stereotype that you've got to kind of live up to as such. I find you speak different. You obviously, being Scottish, I had to speak a bit slower, a bit softer, clearer. You mind your P's and Q's.
Those high standards are met, then you are very politely asked to sort of think about your future.
Never more are these exacting standards imperative than in preparing for state banquets.
Machinery of Buckingham Palace is pretty well oiled, and it probably takes about 4 days to set up for a state banquet. That's from the moment that the table is assembled to the moment that the table furniture is brought out of storage, the crockery and cutlery is brought out of storage, the glassware, and the table is polished and the table is laid.
The Queen actually inspects the table to make sure that everything is just right, which is quite something to have the Queen actually come and inspect your work. It's quite nerve-wracking as well.
In recent years, one of the most attention-grabbing state visits was that of the Obamas in 2009.
Thank you so much for having us.
It was physically awkward because the Obamas are so tall, and then they've got this very tiny Queen, who I think when people meet her, they don't realise how tiny she is. And they both really sweetly sort of hunch slightly to talk to her. But it did seem to work. There did seem to be more warmth going on there than you might normally get from a state visit.
That warmth subsequently created unexpected headlines.
I saw it happen. You think, oh, don't do that. Don't touch the Queen. That's a butler's reaction, a royal butler's reaction to what's going on.
Well, the press went apoplectic, but then you see the press set themselves up as judge and jury. How dare anybody touch the Queen?
But with Michelle, it was an absolutely wonderful, friendly gesture. She put her arm around the Queen's shoulders. And I believe at the time they were discussing how the shoes made their feet ache and they were waiting to get their shoes off. So it was congruent, it fitted with the conversation.
What is more interesting for me is the Queen reciprocated, which means that she was also saying, I feel equally warm towards you and I like you. And I wonder from her point of view whether that was also an instinctive show of warmth. So you've got these two women in this situation where there are tense rules in place. One breaks with the rules and the other says, it's okay, it's cool, I like you.
But the Queen, I have never seen her reciprocate and put her arm in a reciprocal gesture, which she did around Michelle Obama's waist. So to do that, which was mirroring and changing her state, was enormously important. It was like finding that postage stamp you've been looking for because it's so rare.
Of course, not many are as comfortable around royalty as Michelle Obama.
What is quite interesting, though, is how flustered people do become in the Queen's company. I've seen at big receptions at Buckingham Palace, particularly for Queen's Award to Industry, industrialists who are used to dealing with multi-million-pound contracts, suddenly be faced with the Queen getting flustered and thinking, God, what do I do? And instead of bowing at the neck, they curtsy. The Queen has seen it before. She doesn't react. But if you read the Queen, and if you've worked for the Queen, then you know how to read her. You can see a slight glint in her eye, thinking, we've been here before.
So what exactly are the rules?
So say you were about to meet a member of the royal family. For example, Prince Charles will offer his hand to you first. Prince Charles will start the conversation with you first, and then you answer back to him, but keeping it short. You don't go into a long conversation, and you stick to whatever the subject is, you stick to that subject.
There's also clothing protocol.
Say you're at an event with a member of the royal family and you want to remove your jacket from a suit, say, you can't remove it unless a member of the royal family removes theirs first. And even if they remove it, they've then got to give you permission to take yours off.
And there's much more than just the menu to consider if you're dining out.
When the Queen finishes, strictly speaking, that's when the plates will be cleared. So if you're still eating, then I'm sorry to say that your food will be taken away from you if the Queen has stopped and the clearance of the service has begun.
Though perhaps the most famous perceived protocol isn't actually enforced.
The royals don't tell anyone that they have to bow or curtsy. It's completely up to your own discretion. Obviously, you shouldn't be over-familiar. You wouldn't be wanting to go up to Prince Philip and patting him affectionately on the back, because that would be deemed inappropriate.
What has built up in the mists of time is this sort of automatic response from men to bow from the neck and ladies to curtsy. If you don't bow and if you don't curtsy, you're not going to get shipped off to the Tower of London.
I've even seen Prince Charles fist bumping somebody. About 2 years ago, he was at a school and I think he fist bumped one of the kids, kind of went up to him and he did it back. And initially you're kind of thinking, oh, you can't fist bump the Prince of Wales. But then suddenly it's like, why not? You know, because it's kids, it's the modern world we live in. Princess William and Harry, we see doing these kind of things all the time. And I think it is important because it makes them seem more down to earth, more human, if you like.
In the long history of the monarchy, service staff have come and gone, but few have left a more indelible mark than John Brown.
I think there's a fascination around Queen Victoria's relationship with John Brown because it appeared so mismatched. On one hand, you have a queen of decades standing, a former empress of India, effectively becoming close to a Scottish gillie, a working class chap who I think may have ruffled feathers among other courtiers because of his no-nonsense approach.
Brown began working at Balmoral as a 21-year-old and was described by the Queen as an invaluable Highland servant, but the pair grew closer after Prince Albert's passing.
She was somebody who insisted that her entourage included influential men who she could trust and rely on as she carried on with her reign, despite feeling such a deep sense of loss and grief because of Albert's death. And I think latterly she found that she had a lot in common with John Brown because she enjoyed outdoor pursuits, she enjoyed being in Scotland, staying at Balmoral and the bracing air up in the Scottish Highlands. So there was a sense of an affinity there, even though obviously they came from very, very different sides of the track.
John Brown didn't bow and kowtow. He was a raw Scotsman who said it as it was, treated Victoria as he would treat anybody else, without any particular deference. And she liked that, and she enjoyed his company, and he amused her.
Speculation as to whether their relationship went deeper continues to this day. But are there any clues in the rare photos of them together?
She had a permanent look of mourning, which I think she's very much using here, which is just looking ahead, looking very downcast, very unexcited to be... she's not showing any signs that she might enjoy either his company or the horse, which is quite odd, very difficult to sit on a horse without a change of body language. He's not quite adopted the sort of humble servant look. He's pretty much facing out the camera. So there is a degree of personality emerging here and challenge that may have got people talking.
The solo snaps of Brown are perhaps more telling.
You cannot look at those photographs without going, wow, you know, if she didn't spot the sexuality in that guy, it was absolutely painted with a very heavy brush. He's got the alpha leg splay going on. He's got the biggest sporran I've ever seen. And in case we don't get the message, he's got his two hands in fists on either side of the sporran. And a ruggedly good-looking guy. Probably not like anything that Victoria had seen down in London either.
Could Victoria's years of a strictly regimented rural lifestyle have also brought them closer together?
It might be described as delayed rebellion, because some of those rebellious impulses may have had to be pushed to one side because she had to assume responsibility as heir to the throne. But when you have pushed your rebellion to the side, where do they go? It's like, you know, that's the elephant in the room. They just grow and grow. So I wonder whether this was part of that exploration. I didn't do it then. What about doing it now?
Brown passed away in 1883, with Victoria erecting a statue in his memory at Balmoral. She continued to mourn him until her own death in 1901, as both took any secrets they may have shared to the grave. Ever since then, the royals have battled to be perceived the right way in the public glare.
All of us here know that we are present at the making of history.
Most of her speeches would greatly benefit from being more natural.
In the position it occupies.
But when impediments give the wrong impression, hand-picked reinforcements were drafted in behind the scenes.
You don't become an official, personalised spokesman. You are an anonymous spokesman.
Born into a life of public service, it has always been essential for the royal family to retain a constant presence in the eyes of the nation.
Well, the Queen's mantra has always been, I need to be seen to be believed. And equally, yes, of course, subjects expect the royals to be out and about in public doing good. They're part funded by the taxpayer, and so they need to justify their existence. And they need to ensure that people think that they aren't on the take, but that they're actually giving back in return for their position of huge wealth and privilege.
For nearly a century, a select few have helped the royals maintain a visible personal persona, ever since developments in radio technology provided them with a way of addressing the public directly.
I suppose radio was perceived by the royal family, like everybody else, as a means of what the BBC mantra used to be, to educate, to entertain and to inform.
In an unfortunate twist of fate, the man who was expected to be the figurehead of this new communication was George VI, a king afflicted with a stammer.
If you've got a speech impediment, you're always consciously aware of it. So it will alter your behaviour when you come to, let's say, interact with new people or big groups of people, because you will feel as if all the spotlight is on you and you are worried about making a mistake. And sometimes worrying about making a mistake can increase the likelihood of tripping up over your words because you become overwhelmed with anxiety.
And so one man had been drafted in to help quash George's nerves, Australian Lionel Logue. With speech therapy still very much in its infancy, George had regularly frequented Logue's practice on Harley Street throughout the late 20s and into the 30s. However, his vocal vulnerability remained evident when he unveiled a statue to his father at Windsor Castle shortly after becoming king.
He is fortunate also in the position it occupies. Standing as it does against the background of the castle, reminding us of the long and continuous history.
And you can see the way that he uses the notes more as a prop to look down at. It allows him to use a cut-off with his eye, so he hasn't got to look at the audience. It implies a degree of social phobia that it was the people out there that he found daunting. You can also see him almost beating himself up with some strong blinks when he goes to stammer, and I feel so sorry for him, because the more that he's going to do that, the more likely he is that he's going to do it. So his whole delivery is very painful at this stage.
With just months until his coronation, George needed Lionel more than ever. Reports suggest they were meeting for an hour every day, weekends included, as they battled to keep the stammer at bay.
Imagine if you are in a position of power and authority and you know you have a stammer, you know you have to make a speech, you know that people are going to be listening intently to what you say. As a result, you become more consciously aware of what's coming out of your mouth, you feel more exposed, you might become more overwhelmed, and feelings of anxiety may actually affect how you then subsequently speak. So in order to combat that, I think people use different techniques, like, listening to music, distraction, all these things stop you putting the spotlight directly into your own face where you feel, naked and vulnerable.
Logue based his pioneering technique around using breathing exercises to give George the confidence to relax and avoid tension-induced muscle spasms while speaking, and the hard work paid off.
Never before has a newly crowned king been able to talk to all his peoples in their own homes on the day of his coronation.
Logue continued to help George VI with his radio broadcast to the British Empire throughout the Second World War.
It was suspected that George VI wasn't up to the task, but of course he proved himself to be this amazing king during wartime, with all of his speeches against all the odds, considering he had a stammer and a stutter.
Without freedom, there can be no enduring peace, and without peace, no enduring freedom.
George and Lionel remained in constant contact until the King's death in 1952. 146 Harley Street now bears a plaque immortalising their extraordinary friendship. After she inherited the throne, the Queen too had her own battles with public speaking.
All of us here know that we are present at the making of history.
As writer Lord Altrincham openly criticised her manner of address.
He thought she was very stilted. He thought that she didn't present properly, and he didn't think that she was what we call today as user-friendly, in touch.
I think that most of her speeches would greatly benefit from being more natural, from even if they're prepared, from seeming to be the sort of speech that she would make.
It caused offence to monarchists, so much so that when he left studios, he got punched by a monarchist. There are those who say good on him, and there are those who say silly chap, but mixed opinion. But it was really not attack on the monarchy as a system, but attack on the monarch as an individual.
Yet remarkably, Altrincham became an unlikely palace ally, as his suggestion to televise the Christmas speech implemented a tradition now lasting over 6 decades, making the Queen a stronger orator as a result.
You look at the Queen today and the way she delivers a message today and the way she did on her first television broadcast in 1957, they are so vastly different. Today she's the consummate professional. She's a one-take monarch. It's probably evolved into something a lot more personal today than it was all those years ago in 1957.
And having worked as a palace press secretary for 12 years, Dickie Arbiter knows better than most the importance of effective communication.
If I needed something, requested something to be done, I would write a note to the Queen and it would come back to me within 2 or 3 hours. I would have contact with her if I was out on engagement with her or doing an engagement within Buckingham Palace. Whose decision of what info is given to the press and what isn't depends what the info is. And each household has its own ideas of what should be given out and what shouldn't be given out. You take, for example, when the 3 children were born to the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge, they made sure that they paused briefly on the steps of the Lindo wing outside so that photographers and news crews could get their pictures. Then it's a completely different story with Harry and Meghan. They kept Archie under wraps for a couple of days. The announcement was a bit of a mess. It was announced that the Duchess was going into labour when 5 hours beforehand she'd already given birth. The christening was kept a secret, so nobody knew who the godparents were. No, there are right ways and wrong ways of doing it. There's no point being secretive about it, because eventually the truth will out.
But as Dickie discovered, sometimes getting the truth out at the right time is a delicate balance.
I remember very well when the Prince of Wales broke his arm playing polo. I went out and talked to the media. It was a major fall, major break, and the arm very swollen. And when asked would he play polo again, I said every likelihood that he will play polo again. So you play for the situation at the time. I did get into a bit of trouble with the press secretary at the time for having spoken on camera, because that's not what press secretaries did in the old days. You don't speak on camera, you are an anonymous spokesman.
Fortunately, the man himself didn't seem to mind.
When I finally went back into the hospital, he said, I've just seen you on television, thank you, that's just what I want. So I did the right thing. You have to make a judgment call there and then. There was no time to contact anybody. You have to go by your own gut feeling. Today she's the consummate professional. She's a one-take monarch. It's probably evolved into something a lot more personal today than it was all those years ago in 1957.
And having worked as a palace press secretary for 12 years, Dickie Arbiter knows better than most the importance of effective communication.
If I needed something,
Oh my God.
requested something to be done, I would write a note to the Queen and it would come back to me within 2 or 3 hours. I would have contact with her if I was out on engagement with her or doing an engagement within Buckingham Palace. Whose decision of what info is given to the press and what isn't depends what the info is. And each household has its own ideas of what should be given out and what shouldn't be given out. You take, for example, when the 3 children were born to the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge, they made sure that they paused briefly on the steps of the Lindo wing outside so that photographers and news crews could get their pictures. Then it's a completely different story with Harry and Meghan. They kept Archie under wraps for a couple of days. The announcement was a bit of a mess. It was announced that the Duchess was going into labour when 5 hours beforehand she'd already given birth. The christening was kept a secret, so nobody knew who the godparents were. No, there are right ways and wrong ways of doing it. There's no point being secretive about it, because eventually the truth will out.
But as Dickie discovered, sometimes getting the truth out at the right time is a delicate balance.
I remember very well when the Prince of Wales broke his arm playing polo. I went out and talked to the media. It was a major fall, major break.
Oh my God.
And the arm very swollen. And when asked would he play polo again, he said every likelihood that he will play polo again. So you play for the situation at the time. I did get into a bit of trouble with the press secretary at the time for having spoken on camera, because that's not what press secretaries did in the old days. You don't speak on camera, you are an anonymous spokesman.
Fortunately, the man himself didn't seem to mind.
When I finally went back into the hospital, he said, I've just seen you on television, thank you, that's just what I want. So I did the right thing. You have to make a judgment call there and then. There was no time to contact anybody. You have to go by your own gut feeling.
Yet another important cog in the royal media merry-go-round are the specialist photographers, like veteran Arthur Edwards, who has been working with the royals for 45 years.
I think my relationship pretty good. I mean, William calls me Arthur, I call him Sir. And the same with Prince Charles and the other members of the royal family. And if it's a female member, I call her ma'am, and I'm never, ever familiar and never will be. I mean, we're never going to be bosom pals going to the public ever, but we have a very good working relationship with most of them. And William and Catherine, of course, they are just seasoned pros now when it comes to pictures. They know you've got to get pictures, and they try to help you. And I'm not saying they pose or anything, but they know that you've got a space to fill in the paper the next day, and they help.
Arthur's lens has truly seen it all, and perhaps set an unfortunate trend of making Charles's hairline a talking point.
Outside Melbourne's School of Music, it was very hot, certainly hot enough to burn the bald spot.
After the first of many subsequent shots featuring his bald spot got published.
We had it on page 1, this huge picture at the back of Prince Charles's head. And the following Wednesday, his policeman said to me, I think he's going to have a word with you about that, so be prepared. And he came by on his horse and he said, "Oh, are you the man who took the picture of my bald spot?" I said, "Yes, sir." I said, he said, "Well, how many people saw that?" I said, "Well, I suppose about 10 million. He said, 10 million? I said, "Yeah." I said, "Well, the paper sells 3.5 million copies a day, I think we were selling then." And he said, "Oh," he said, "that's the reason why everywhere I go, people are photographing the back of my head."
Despite the uneasy start, 4 decades on, they are much more than just prince and photographer.
Over the years, watching what he did with his life, it changed me a bit, you know. It made me realise that this man, he never boasts about what he does. He will never take a compliment for what he does. But he does some amazing things, and he's achieved an awful lot. He'd be a great king too, and I just hope to God I can cover his coronation.
With countless coverage over the years, how much will ever get a royal viewing?
They don't necessarily read the stories. What they do, they get a press summary, given the sort of 2-line detail of what's in the story. If they want to read the story, they've got all the papers. They can go and read it for themselves, but they're given usually a press summary. Queen will read the Racing Post more than she'll read any other newspaper.
Now, with constantly evolving means of exposure, never more has it been essential for the media teams within the palace to keep the output flowing.
Certainly the royals have had to move with the times when it comes to technology, and this sense that they need to be as transparent as ever and across social media platforms has been embraced by the palace. I think back in the day it was the Queen who sent the first email from a military base somewhere, and equally the royals are now on Instagram, on Twitter. They have their own website that's constantly being revamped. You have a videographer on most royal jobs involving senior royals because they know the importance of video in terms of capturing hearts and minds online.
With cameras now ubiquitous, the Queen is adamant to always look the part.
The Queen's always cared about how she appears presentationally and is always dressed to impress.
Luckily, her dresser, Angela Kelly, aptly accompanying the Queen here to London Fashion Week, is never far away.
Angela Kelly is by far the Queen's closest aide. And I say close in both ways, in that she's in an intimate role because she is the Queen's dresser and she's the keeper of all of her jewellery and insignia. So as far as her role is concerned, it is very hands-on with the Queen. But equally, she is close in the sense that she has been long-serving, discreet, loyal and trustworthy. There was famously a moment when the Queen and Angela Kelly were side by side, and apparently the Queen made a remark along the lines of, "We could be sisters," because they were dressed in similar clothing. And that's really an extraordinary thing for the Queen to say when Angela Kelly is a Liverpudlian docker's daughter, very working class background.
Over the years, she's built up this relationship with the Queen, and it will be a unique relationship. You know, there'll be very few people that have that relationship with the monarch, and she's one of them. And it's quite nice also for her to know that the Queen trusts and respects her in that way, because to have the Queen's trust is huge.
Some parts of the job extend their connection even further.
In the past, been known to tread in the Queen's shoes to make sure that they're comfortable upon Her Majesty first wearing them.
But as Angela strives to keep the Queen comfy, do the consistencies of her wardrobe in turn provide a bit of reassurance for us all?
There's something familiar about the way that she carries a handbag in the crook of her arm, and her shoes never changing and her hairstyle being the same, along with her jewellery often. People almost see her wardrobe as being in line with the continuity she represents when it comes to her reign.
So the Queen keeps her closest aide around her at all times. But in this day and age, is it possible for the royals to strike up a genuinely strong bond with anyone?
The Queen's always cared about how she appears presentationally and has always dressed to impress.
Luckily, her dresser, Angela Kelly, aptly accompanying the Queen here to London Fashion Week, is never far away.
Angela Kelly is by far the Queen's closest aide. And I say close in both ways, in that she's in an intimate role because she is the Queen's dresser and she's the keeper of all of her jewellery and insignia. So, as far as her role is concerned, it is very hands-on with the Queen. But equally, she is close in the sense that she has been long-serving, discreet, loyal and trustworthy. There was famously a moment when the Queen and Angela Kelly were side by side, and apparently the Queen made a remark along the lines of, "We could be sisters," because they were dressed in similar clothing. And that's really an extraordinary thing for the Queen to say when Angela Kelly is a Liverpudlian docker's daughter, very working class background.
Over the years, she's built this relationship with the Queen, and it will be a unique relationship. You know, there will be very few people that have that relationship with the monarch, and she's one of them. And it's quite nice also for her to know that the Queen trusts and respects her in that way, because to have the Queen's trust is huge.
Some parts of the job extend their connection even further.
In the past, been known to tread in the Queen's shoes to make sure that they're comfortable upon Her Majesty first wearing them.
But as Angela strives to keep the Queen comfy, do the consistencies of her wardrobe in turn provide a bit of reassurance for us all?
There's something familiar about the way that she carries a handbag in the crook of her arm, and her shoes never changing and her hairstyle being the same, along with her jewellery often. People almost see her wardrobe as being in line with the continuity she represents when it comes to her reign.
So the Queen keeps her closest aide around her at all times. But in this day and age, is it possible for the royals to strike up a genuinely strong bond with anyone? In a life surrounded by rules and regiment, it has always been difficult for members of the royal family to create true friendships beyond the everyday machinery of the monarchy. Yet the Queen found a friend in Margaret Rhodes.
Margaret Rhodes was a cousin to the Queen. They'd been brought up together, so their relationship went way back into their sort of formative years. And they were always very close.
I mean, we enjoyed very silly outdoor games that could keep us happy all day.
She is effectively more or less the Queen's age, and therefore experienced most of the highlights of the Queen's reign with her. So was present at the coronation and indeed at the Queen's wedding. She lived in a grace and favour home at Windsor and would regularly see the Queen effectively as friends and confidants.
When it comes to Margaret Rhodes and the Queen, they've known each other a very long time, before the Queen was the Queen. Now, there is something about that gives a sense of safety, bonding and trust, which can become very meaningful to a monarch who may at times feel very isolated in her role and very alone. And when you have such a powerful bond of trust, and you've probably tested those boundaries over time and proven that this person I can put my faith into, I think that becomes a much more powerful connection.
And this feeling was mutual.
A certain person who's just always been there, has always looked the same, and has just gives one the feeling that life is safer with her there somehow.
They had a little ritual whereby after church they would meet up for a gin and dubonnet and a gossip. And also I think the Queen valued Margaret because she wasn't a yes woman. She had her own opinions, and I think she'd expressed them in quite a forthright manner. And the Queen really appreciated her lack of obsequiousness, but also her candour and honesty.
Now, perhaps allowing one or two people inside that real tight inner circle is what sustains you.
Now, in the modern-day era of celebrity, many of the younger royals have had to try and forge their own friendships whilst living in the limelight.
They're meant to look a cut above the kind of people that frequent a red carpet, and therefore they've got to be careful. There needs to be a certain sort of allure and elusivity to the royals, which doesn't necessarily mean that they're a great mash-up with people who frequent the showbiz world.
Any look at recent royal wedding guest lists could read like a roll call for a Hollywood blockbuster, music festival and sports spectacular all rolled into one. But it would be hard to call any of these associates true friends.
But it is difficult for the younger members. We've had more recently Prince Harry, a friend of his, who gossiped a bit too much about the prince, and he was ghosted. So it is very difficult. It's about knowing who the royals can trust and who they can't trust. And you only realise that, and then they let you down.
So if you take Princes William and Harry, most of their closest friends are from prep school or Eton, and they go so far back that they are in the so-called circle of trust, which never leaks and is unwaveringly loyal. In fact, William and Harry used to have this trick where if they suspected somebody was telling tales out of school, they would feed them a false line, see if it ended up in the headlines the following week, and then they'd know that they'd caught the person who had been mouthing off about them.
The uncertainty in social circles is also mirrored within the palace walls, with no one guaranteed a job for life.
The Queen is no longer here and Prince Charles becomes king. That'll be interesting to see what happens, because when he becomes king, technically everybody that works for him is unemployed. The questions will be, does he keep the same staff? Does he have... The Queen's obviously got her own staff. Do they remain? Do they go? So there's going to be a lot of questions as to what will happen in the future.
Of course, some retainers will always remain loyal, having seen a side to the royals many are not privy to.
Being a royalty protection officer gave me some great experiences, put me into some great environments. It was most probably a massive change from my previous role, where I was an armed response vehicle officer patrolling the streets of London, was probably working in some of the not so nice areas, and then you get taken away from that after selection, and you are at a dinner in Mansion House.
The Queen, of course, she's just special. I mean, she's the same calm person all the time, never gets flustered. She walks the same pace. She does exactly the same thing all the time. You could sort of, you watch her and you know when she's going to turn, you know when she's going to smile. You almost know when she's going to get in the car, She's just, it's nice to do it.
If everything goes the way it's supposed to, one day I'll be able to say technically I was a butler for, at some point, for 3 monarchs, because I've looked after the Queen, I've looked after Prince Charles, and I've looked after Prince William.
But for anyone who has to move from downstairs to up, the responsibility has never been something to take lightly.
It's not an easy job, because at the end of the day you're working 24/7, you are on duty and on parade 24/7. It's a great honour working for the Queen, seeing her in private and in public.
But even in an age where the royals seem to be as prevalent as they ever have been, some elements of their lives will always remain a secret, as the monarchy attempts to retain at least a modicum of mystery to maintain our fascination for years to come.